Okay, Thomas Fried here. So, what's wrong with the income tax and income tax system? First, where do you start with this? It intentionally divides the population on some arbitrary basis into distinct classes of persons that are then treated differently under the law. And through that different treatment of the different classes created by the law, tax law in this particular case, all of the constitutionally guaranteed rights to equal opportunity, equal protection, equal access, and equal rights are destroyed amongst all of the classes and across the entire population by allowing the tax to treat the citizens non-uniformly as constitutionally required of all indirect taxation. Based on economic status, the people are kept constantly at war with one another, and the Congress cannot represent the whole of the population, but must choose between the classes which to represent. This insidiously engineered division of the population and its political representation is being used to surreptitiously attack and seditiously undermine the fundamental constitutional foundation at law of a limited government possessed of only certain specifically enumerated powers, thus preserving the American people's freedom and liberty and sovereign role, possessed of guaranteed rights to both work and to private property, to freedom of speech, to freedom of press, etc., etc. You know the Bill of Rights. Consider this then. Can Congress write law that specifically commands that the Christian be treated differently under the law than the Jew, or the Buddhist, or the Hindu, or the Muslim? No, of course not. Can Congress write law that specifically commands that the black man or woman be treated differently under the law than the white man or woman? No, of course not. Can Congress write law that specifically commands that the male be treated differently than the female, or the old different than the young, or the gay different from the straight? Again, the answer is consistently no. So can Congress write law that specifically commands that the wealthy be treated differently than the poor? Or that the poor be treated differently under the law and given fewer or lesser or maybe even more rights or protection or opportunity than the wealthy or the middle class or anyone else? And again, I would argue no, the law is required to be uniform, or it is not constitutional, specifically in the realm of taxation. Why? Because the law, taxes, must be uniform in order to preserve equal opportunity, equal protection, equal rights, equal access under the law for all persons. Furthermore, the law must not and cannot be prejudicial in either its application or operation amongst the citizenry, which this class system immediately establishes an operational practice. Under the Constitution, every minority is supposed to be protected everywhere in America. The U.S. Constitution was set up to protect the private property rights of we the people by establishing a representative system of limited government of specific enumerated powers that would not harass our people and eat out their substance in their exercise. The Constitution fundamentally exists to protect the basic human rights and property rights of all of the people, but in particular those who owned property in 1776. In other words, equal rights of the wealthy. But when it comes to constitutional law today, now suddenly I'm supposed to believe that Congress can write law that specifically commands that the population, rather than articles of commerce, can be divided into classes by communistic class legislation where the wealthy are treated substantially differently than the poor, and vice versa, of course, simply because the government wants our money to feed itself and its enormous bureaucracies trying to rule us that represent no one and aren't elected, and enforce today philosophy and de facto practices in place of a de jure administration of the written law under the Constitution. Additionally, the created classes of the income tax brackets created by the tax imposed, and then the political representatives of each particular class are politically set at the throats of one another in a class warfare system. And the representatives must represent and advocate for only their own chosen class members and never the whole of the population. Instead of being able to properly represent the American people and its population as a whole in its entirety, with uniformity of law with regards to the treatment by the law of the people of each and every class. Thus, the class warfare predicated and defined by the tax brackets defined within the unconstitutional operations of the IRS's administrative and enforcement operational practices regarding the enforcement of the federal personal income tax splits the country in two into divided classes that are defined and created by the non-uniform income tax law, whose resultant internal class conflicts gradually destroy productivity and ultimately destroy the cohesive fabric of the entire society and nation and our population. It can easily be argued that the federal personal income tax is fundamentally unconstitutional because it is neither apportioned as a direct tax nor uniform as an indirect tax, as all taxes are required to be one or the other under the U.S. Constitution. A tax that is neither apportioned nor uniform, but rather is only graduated, is not authorized in the Constitution, but it is in the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, which specifically reads a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. And that's what America has been compelled to practice through the unconstitutional enforcement operations of the IRS and the seditious rulings of the judges who are enforcing not the law, not the Constitution, but judicial legislation. The tax is fundamentally unequal and unfair as there is no equal treatment of the people of the different divided classes. And thus the rich avoid the tax by machinations like incorporation and trust formation that are generally unavailable to the common man to utilize in practice. Therefore, the weight and burden of the entire tax system falls directly onto the backs of labor, where it was never intended to be laid, and mostly on the middle and lower classes, who are not allowed to deduct their expenses as a basis for determining profit, income, taxable income, from which the amount of tax is measured and calculated, and from whom the tax is collected at the source by withholding agents at the highest rates. Enforcement by the IRS is arbitrary and capricious and is not fixed in written law, and there are no statutory or proper constitutional foundations to support the current de facto enforcement operational practices, which are based in nothing but communistic opinion and not the written law nor the Constitution. Being over 2,500 pages long, the income tax law is not properly understood or known by the general population, who are, of course, taken advantage of through their ignorance of the subject details, because remember, ignorance of the law is no excuse. The de facto tax system seditiously undermines and economically attacks the individual's exercise of certain rights and over-empowers the central federal government and the institutional bureaucracy of the IRS. It doesn't adequately fund the government. It doesn't raise sufficient revenues and thus forces endless borrowing and debt by the government. It is vague in application. It is both arbitrary and capricious in the institutional, operational application and enforcement engaged in by the IRS and the DOJ. It is both complex and confusing, intentionally so, we think, So no two readers, or even accountants or tax lawyers, of the same income tax laws with the same set of earnings documents see the same thing in the written laws controlling the accounting of the tax, and they all come up with a different bottom line. Isn't that wonderful? 7 opinions, and the other 6 were all okay, but the one that you used was wrong. Oh, you just missed it by 1. 10 different accountants or so-called tax experts are just as likely as not to give you 10 different amounts of tax as bottom lines for the measured amount of the tax owed, which makes the enforced application of any one of the 10 measures arbitrary, capricious, and void for vagueness. The administration of the tax is expensive to society and the individual. Billions of dollars and millions of man hours are expended in its administration to avoid profits. 3% to 8% of all corporate revenues are expended today by the corporation on tax planning to try to avoid as much profit as possible so as to avoid too much taxation over the next 2 to 5 years. Isn't that wonderful? They're all planning to not make money, and they want you to invest in that company. The institutional administration of the tax is abusive and wastes precious national resources both in the private sector and within the government. It is unproductive as it motivates our companies to avoid having profit, so it in fact works to diminish and destroy our national productivity. It pits the government bureaucracy with the corporate bureaucracy against we the people, destroying government that is representative of the population. It becomes representative of the corporation. It promotes being ruled by the government through the payment by the conquered people of an annual custom and tribute, which feeds the Federal Reserve Bank, a private corporation, not the United States Treasury, as tax law requires of all tax. Instead of being represented by a government, you are now ruled by one that operates under an unconstitutional system of class warfare and virtual peonage, utilizing a system of graduated and unconstitutionally non-uniform tax brackets. It promotes the selling of law through loopholes, carve-outs, and monopolistic favoritism to the corporations, corrupting both the Congress and the private sector. It hinders real long-term business and planning. It both hinders and hurts the American economy by removing as disposable income some 30 to 40% of the domestic salaries and wages of the citizens from their own communities, villages, towns, cities, counties, and states, and local stores therein. All that money is removed from the local environment. Taxing profits demotivates the corporations to make, show, or have any profits at all annually, or have profitable operations at all across time. Instead, lobbying Congress with the earnings as expenses to be written off to literally buy favorable law from Congress in a corrupt system in order to avoid having to compete with any real or other business competitors. The institutional nature of the collection and enforcement operations of the income tax as a direct tax only grows the government and the corporate bureaucracies without any real or meaningful return on the expenditures to the people of the future, because those bureaucracies produce nothing while consuming the precious national resources of both money and time that would otherwise be available to conduct and fund other additional or new business opportunities of we the people in the private sector. The federal personal income tax is communistic, being the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, and it is not constitutional or enforced as a direct tax imposed on the earnings derived from the labors or the work of we the American people in an exercise of the right to work. Rights are not taxable activities to the federal government, nor is their exercise. The income tax works to disconnect the population, we the people, Main Street, from the companies and businesses. Wall Street, because there are no profits from the businesses being returned to the investors as dividends, because the companies are planning for and building, well, there's no return to the investors because the companies are planning to not have profits. But it is only the companies and businesses that are actually planning for and building a better and more connected, technologically oriented, more sophisticated and more capable, compassionate society and its social support, infrastructure, grids, and services. Without the support of Main Street, Wall Street will partner with the government to lock down things as they are today in a system of fascism that opposes change, and rather than being its agent and ushering in the future, and rather than planning for a better tomorrow with the new technologies and stronger connections and capabilities, that always scare the government. So it wants to lock down what is in place today and limit anything new that it cannot control, so that it stays in charge. Of course, in today's world of technological domination, a government that stops the technological development in its own country will be destroyed within a matter of short time. Thus, the income tax works to completely disconnect the American people, Main Street, from the future, because they're no longer investing in the companies building it. And in order to keep the people serving the government, as they have been for 80 years, that's the intent, is to reverse the relationship, to force people to serve government rather than have government represent and serve the people. And of course, the institutional bureaucratic administration of the income tax has set loose an army of petty bureaucrats to harass and eat out our substance. Harass our people and eat out our substance, to prey upon them while depleting and attacking their successes, productivity, and prosperity at every turn, and more aggressively at every level of each greater success. All done in the name of tax only. Do you remember the line from the Declaration of Independence? He, referring to King George, hath sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. It was one of the items causing for the Declaration of Independence to be removed from England's control, one of the causal items. The de facto institutional income tax collection and enforcement system today promotes and creates multiple repeated confrontations, sometimes violent, between the citizenry and the government. Unlike legitimate constitutional taxation, where participation in the transaction that is known to be taxed and paying the tax are both either completely voluntary, or the burden of the tax can be shifted from the pocket of the taxpayer, the tax collector, to some other party, usually by withholding, as with employment, or by an addition of the tax to the bill to be paid with the cost of goods or services at their purchase point, like in the store and a sales tax. There is no confrontation with the government. There is no violence. There is no application of force. The tax is voluntarily assumed and paid, and the statutory liability for the payment of the tax never reaches the general population. That would be unconstitutionally direct taxation, which is still prohibited under Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, and Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4. Tax being paid by the collector is indirect, so it's, as I've pointed out before, it's collected by the employers, and they're the taxpayer with the liability to turn over what has been collected under the employee's allowance. And in 1913, the income tax was collected by withholding agents who were only authorized to withhold money from non-resident foreign persons and corporations to collect the tax. And there, the tax collectors made liable for the payment of the tax in 1913, the original income tax laws, and they added the class of tax collectors employers in 1945. And then they had everyone forget about the limitation of the withholding agent, who was not allowed to collect from citizens, and deceived everyone into asking their employer to collect the tax from them, even though it wasn't imposed on them. and they asked for it on the W-4 under the misperception, misconsumption, assumption, and presumption they were subject to a tax that they were not subject to, but had become accustomed to because of the victory tax during World War II, which expired after 2 years. So, in summary, the whole thing, the income tax system, is a complete and total constitutional fraud. They're enforcing the second plank of the Communist Manifesto, not constitutional taxation by impost, duty, or excise. Anyone who tries to tell you differently is either an idiot or a communist. You'll have to figure out the answer to that question on your own at that time. It results in communistic class warfare, where the classes are defined literally by the tax brackets of the income tax system that prevents representation of the whole population by any single politician or party, as the politicians are compelled to pick only one class or the other to represent from their seat in Congress, and thus dividing the population permanently and creating a class warfare system of competition between the classes to have their group of politicians pass laws that favor them and treat the other classes differently and less favorably, destroying equal rights, equal opportunity, equal access, and equal protection. Thus, the income tax destroys the Fourth Amendment's guarantee and protection to we the people to be secure in one's papers, houses, and effects, person papers, houses, and effects. It destroys the Fifth Amendment guarantee of protection from compelled self-incrimination to be used as evidence against you. It has been used to destroy our freedom of religion by regulating the creation of new churches, which can only be done under IRS authority and granted approval of said applications, as though government had control over God. It is completely destructive of the constitutional system of private property and the system of a limited government of only specifically enumerated powers, as properly and limited under the Constitution, because once the government is authorized to take 1%, the rate of tax imposed in 1913, there is nothing to prevent them from taking 100% and reducing the entire population of America to abject slavery under such conditions. The rate of the tax has already risen under past law enacted by Congress to over 90% tax on the very wealthy, the highest taxed individuals in the late 1950s. And now we see that the IRS and other government agencies, the DOJ, the FBI, have been politicized and weaponized. You might throw in the EPA, the CIA, OSHA, the Department of Education, Department of Energy, and maybe a few others, but we'll go on. So that they can be used as a weapon against conservative political and philosophical opposition in order to intimidate and or squelch completely any anti-liberal oppositional speech or groups or protests, and all legitimate grievances and complaints, thus destroying a representative government and putting in place of it the institutional operation of the state as dictator and ruler who intimidates the philosophical opposition with politicized legal attacks rather than representative we the people as a whole in the population. The very concept of classes within the population that are created as a direct result of the enactment of some law, who are then to each be treated differently under the law than the other people, for any reason, on any matter, is completely repugnant and totally anathema to the founding principles and fundamental operational precepts and concepts of the U.S. Constitution, which is built on the fundamental understanding that law, in order to be just, must treat every man the same as every other man at all times. Thus, we have the constitutional foundational principles of equal opportunity, equal protection, equal rights, private property, and legal due process, under a government of only limited powers that are specifically enumerated and put in place for them to represent the people, not rule them. This de facto system of society we have now, composed of classes and based on this class warfare system, all based on graduated tax brackets, it's nothing but pure progressive socialism straight out of the Communist Manifesto. Again, specifically, the second plank of the Communist Manifesto reads a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Graduated taxation of income is communism, not constitutional taxation by uniform taxation. Is there anyone out there who honestly believes that America will prosper or that any one class will prosper as a result of America taking up and adopting communism and its class warfare system as our form of government and taxation in place of the constitutional democratic republic that we are actually supposed to have and be? Okay, so Thomas Fried, taxfreedom.com, the Thomas Fried channel. Like if your video, like it. Subscribe if you want to hear more. Find your way over to the IRSZoom.com website where you can pick up a $4 copy of The Simple Truth About Income Tax, which lays out all the basic information, makes available to you the understanding that you should have about taxation under our Constitution. Okay, this is Thomas Fried. We'll be back for more later.